You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the journalist and author Christina Patterson and the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, Wallis Simons. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Observer describes the Conservative Party chairman, Nadim Zahawi, as fighting for his political life after his admission of what he called a careless mistake in settling his tax affairs. The Sunday Times leads with a report from the trenches in Ukraine, but also features claims that Boris Johnson had help from Richard Sharp in arranging a loan just weeks before Mr Sharp was appointed chair of the BBC. Mr Johnson has described the reports as rubbish, and Mr Sharp has insisted there is no conflict with his position. The Sunday People says that one of the victims of rapist Metropolitan Policeman David Carrick is to sue the force for damages. The Sunday Express has details of the King's coronation, which it's understood he wants to be a unifying national occasion. The Sunday Telegraph says refugees, NHS staff and the LGBTQ+ community will all have their voices reflected in the celebrations. And staying with matters royal, the Mirror has news of what it describes as a new lie discovered in Prince Harry's memoir, Spare. The Sun claims Prince Andrew's lawyers will attempt to overturn the financial settlement reached with his accuser, Virginia Giuffre. He has always denied any wrongdoing. And the Star tells us that younger generations are shunning sweet snacks like biscuits, instead opting for savoury foods like samosas. A reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Christina Patterson and Wallis Simons. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with the Observer and the story about Nadim Zahawi's tax affairs. He has described it as carelessness and the headline really describing the situation in terms of him fighting for his political life. Christina, do you think that is the case?
Yes, well, we've all done it, haven't we? Sort of forgotten to look at our tax return and suddenly realised we have to pay 4.8 million. So, I have full sympathy for him and his tiny little error. I also don't find it terribly convincing that it is a tiny little error. So, yes, he does seem to be fighting for his political life tonight. And it seems literally breathtaking that this man could have been in charge of the Treasury. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time when all of this was being discussed. And we don't know exactly when the bill was settled, because it seems that he was very evasive about his tax affairs for quite a while, and that he had had lawyers send threats, or what seemed like threats, to people who were investigating them. So I'm afraid this does look extremely fishy. And it seems to me like another death nail in the coffin for this government, which really has a very last days feeling at the moment. So, yes, I imagine Nadim Zahawi at the moment is feeling pretty worried for his future. And the Tory party can't be delighted either that its actual chairman seems to have massively underestimated how much tax he has to pay.
But, Jake, he does say that the tax authority concluded that he'd made a careless but not deliberate error, and he chose to settle the matter and pay what they said was due, which was the right thing to do. Does that not draw a line under the whole affair? He has put out a statement and explained what has gone on.
Well, he has paid the penalty, which we think is about 1.1 million. And as far as we understand it, no further action's been taken by the HMRC. So in a way, justice has been done. He's paid his penalty, he's paid his dues, and he has denied certain elements of the speculation and charges against him, including that he had some offshore involvement. But it's very, very complicated, this case. His statement raised, in many ways, more questions than it answered. It mentioned some founding shares in his company, YouGov, that were owned by his father 22 years ago. It was not quite clear how that came into it. Overall, I think he'll feel that he did the right thing and that he should be seen to be vindicated. But unfortunately, in the eyes of the public, the very best way in which this comes across is that he made an error which led him to have to pay £1.1 million, which only highlights the fabulous wealth at the top of the Tory party, both him and, as we know, Rishi Sunak. And given the rifeness of the politics of envy and how people tend to feel amid the cost of living crisis these days, quite rightly in some cases, in many cases, people are not going to like that very much at all, even in the best case scenario.
Yeah, the paper's pointing to the fact that, you know, the admission does raise questions for the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, over what he knew about the settlement and when, Christina.
Absolutely. And it seems, I mean, really unimaginable, actually, that we could have somebody in charge of the finances of this country who, as Jake says, is so super wealthy that he can happily pay a 1.1 million penalty. And the word penalty does imply that there has been wrongdoing. And OK, he says it, you know, was a little mistake. But did he really not think that there was any tax due on this account? And as has been raised by a number of people, it seems that a substantial number of founding shares of YouGov were given to his father, and his father's role in the business and building of YouGov isn't clear at all. So it looks as if Nadim Zahawi has benefited from an offshore tax investment, which looks as if it was set up to avoid paying tax. And if you have someone, you know, combined with Rishi Sunak, who, as we know, his wife was a non-dom until recently, it looks as if the people who run this country, who spend our taxes, are extremely reluctant to pay any tax. So I don't know. I can't imagine that Rishi Sunak didn't know about this, because this has been under investigation for some time, and you don't appoint someone as chairman of the Tory party without doing a little bit of due diligence. So it seems to me that it looks like complicity at the top, and it looks like tax avoidance is a perfectly acceptable thing for the Tory party until you're found out. And, you know, that's really not a good look. And as Jake says, it's actually very distressing for people when they are really, really struggling to pay their bills, to see people who are so super wealthy that a few million here and there really makes little difference to them.
Jake, what do you make of the excuse from Nadim Zahawi that he was simply careless? What do you think the public will make of that?
Well, I think, as I said, you know, people are going through a cost of living crisis, and they won't appreciate having this level of fabulous wealth thrust into their faces via the headlines. But at the same time, I think that people understand that there's nothing wrong with being rich. It's something that all of us would like to be. And Nadim Zahawi in particular, you know, he worked his way up, you know, from the bottom and worked very, very hard and started YouGov, which is a fabulously successful company, and I'm sure deserves all the winnings that he's managed to get. But I think that nonetheless, having this level of wealth placed front and center in people's minds just encourages the sense that the top of the Tory party is out of touch, and that's not a look that anybody in government would like to foster, particularly with the next election almost around the corner, really, next year. They want to appear like they're feeling the people suffering through the cost of living crisis, and unfortunately stories like this really dispel that notion.
Let's stay with Westminster and move to the Times, Christina, and this story concerning a previous Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and a sum of money, £800,000 to be precise, and a loan that he was proffered, really, helped to arrange a loan by the BBC boss. Take us into the detail of this story. This also is fairly complex.
Well, this is quite an extraordinary story. The allegation is that Richard Sharp, who's the chairman of the BBC, actually helped to arrange the 800,000 loan that emerged in the last week by a rather distant cousin of Boris Johnson's, because Boris Johnson clearly couldn't possibly live on the 140 grand that you get, or whatever it is that you get as Prime Minister, and obviously had to have access to other funds to fund his many children and his rather expensive lifestyle. So that was a pretty shocking revelation in itself. But the fact that, according to this story, Richard Sharp was the person. He was asked by Boris Johnson's cousin to set up the discussions with Boris Johnson, and there was a dinner apparently, and apparently Richard Sharp talked to Simon Case, the cabinet secretary, and it seems that Richard Sharp applied to be BBC chairman, and according to this story, at no point mentioned that he had been involved in helping to set up this loan. He was also, by the way, a good friend, apparently, of Boris Johnson's. They went skiing together. So it certainly looks like cronyism. I understand that Richard Sharp has denied any involvement, and Boris Johnson has, as he generally does, claimed the story is rubbish or a pyramid of piffle or whatever word he has chosen on this particular occasion. But from the story as reported here, it doesn't seem to reflect very well on anyone, actually. And it is alarming if somebody is running the BBC who actually arranged finance that was undeclared for the Prime Minister.
Yes, and we know that the SNP and Labour are calling for investigations into this case, Jake, don't we?
That's right, they are, and one would expect that from opposition parties. I mean, I think it's important to point out right at the start of this that both Boris Johnson and Richard Sharp deny any wrongdoing at all. Richard Sharp denies arranging this £800,000 loan, which was required by Boris Johnson when he was hard up. There were quite a few stories around at the time about him struggling to live on his prime ministerial salary on account of his expensive divorce and his child maintenance payments and doing up Downing Street and all the rest of it. So there are very strong denials coming from both of these men involved, and certainly nothing has been conclusively proven. But this story just connects with the story we spoke about just now about Nadim Zahawi. It's not a good day for the Tories, for the cabinet, with these sorts of stories floating about, which just have the wrong kind of whiff about them and seem to play into people's preconceptions, certainly on the left, of what of Tory sleaze and all the rest of it, which has been around for decades. But it may very well be that neither of these men did anything wrong at all, and it all just could be negative headlines unfairly pinned upon them. But only time will tell, and if there is that investigation, then we'll certainly see the conclusions for ourselves.
No, indeed. Well, Labour has reported the former Prime Minister to the Parliament Standards Watchdog. But just to reiterate what all sides are saying, Richard Sharp, he's been quoted as saying, "There is not a conflict when I simply connected at his request Mr Blythe." He's referring to Sam Blythe, that's the multimillionaire Canadian businessman and incidentally a distant cousin of Boris Johnson, connected him with the cabinet secretary and had no further involvement whatsoever. And a spokesman for Boris Johnson has said this is rubbish. Richard Sharp has never given any financial advice to Boris Johnson, nor has Mr Johnson sought any financial advice from him. There has never been any remuneration or compensation to Mr Sharp from Boris Johnson for this or any other service. Mr Johnson did indeed have dinner with Mr Sharp, whom he has known for almost 20 years, and with his cousin. So what? Big deal. All Mr Johnson's financial arrangements have been properly declared and registered on the advice of officials. Thank you both for the moment. We are going to take a break. And just to say, we're getting a first look at plans for the King's coronation in May. More on that when we come back. You're watching the press preview. Still with me, Christina Patterson and Jake Wallis Simons, or they will be in any second. There you are. Let's have a look at the Express story regarding the King's coronation. We've got some further details released, Christina.
Yes, apparently King Charles wants this to be a joyful occasion. Well, he would hardly want it to be a miserable occasion, but I particularly imagine that after everything that one of his sons has been doing recently, he's particularly keen to make it a very joyful occasion and to bury some of the misery that has caused. But he's talked about wanting it to be a kind of celebration of multicultural Britain, of refugees, of the NHS. which suggests to me that there is a desire to perhaps emphasise some aspects of British life which the Tories have been rather less keen to emphasise in the last few years. And that, I think, was also evident in his Christmas speech, which was very moving, but, made it clear that he has a compassionate heart and does care about people who perhaps the government seems to care slightly less for at the moment. So I hope it will be a joyful occasion. We could certainly do with some cheering up, and I hope it's a great success, and I hope that King Charles himself feels it's a great success, because he's following in some difficult footsteps. His mother was a really wonderful monarch. Whether or not you support the monarchy, I think she did the job magnificently, and she's a tough job to follow.
A raw source saying that the raw source is saying that the coronation needs to be majestic but inclusive to reflect a diverse modern Britain. That's certainly the theme that keeps coming through, Jake.
That's right. It's going to be two main parts to the coronation. The first one is going to be on Saturday, May the 6th. That's going to be the big pomp and circumstance event with 3,000 people. It's going to take 2 hours. It's going to be at Westminster Abbey. And interestingly, Queen Camilla is going to be crowned alongside King Charles, which is a break from precedent. It's a very interesting innovation which he's introducing, as well as the fact that he's going to be wearing military uniform rather than the traditional garters that were worn by his grandfather, great-grandfather, and going back into the mists of time. So that's going to be the big pomp and circumstance event. And then the next day, on the 7th, there's going to be a big party at Windsor Castle, and that's going to involve not just headliners, but also members of the public, community choirs singing together.
It does seem like it will be a big knees up. We are running out of time, Jake, but just to say, it's understood that the monarch is keen for his younger son, Harry, to attend also.